Hello, and thank you for joining me to go through this ILR training session today. My name is Ella, and I'm going to be taking you through looking at the student engagement and student outcomes and how that should be reported in the ILR. There's quite a lot of content to cover in this topic, so we've actually broken it down into two separate presentations. So this is part one, and then make sure you review part two as well afterwards so you get the full picture. So today we're going to be covering the same sort of things that we've been covering in all of the presentations so far. So we'll be looking at the definitions of key fields, what we use these fields for, what we expect from providers when you're trying to determine how to return these fields. We'll be looking at the evidence that should be kept, some common issues found, and then we'll also go through some examples before talking about ways that you can improve the data quality. So in this session, these are the fields we're going to be covering. So mainly around the reporting of the activity dates. We'll also be looking at the mode of study and the STULOAD field. Okay, so what do we use these fields for at the OFS? So the LearnStartDate and the LearnActEndDate, we use these in a lot of calculations of performance metrics and performance indicators. So for example, the access and participation data dashboards. And they are mainly used in the calculation of the continuation metric. We also use them in the allocation of funding, so that it's really important that we get these dates as accurate as possible. The LearnPlanEndDate is used to derive the National Student Survey target population. MODESTUD, so the mode of study, is used to derive mode of study across all of our analysis, so it's a really key field. And the STULOAD is used mainly in the calculation of student numbers for OFS registration fees and other regulatory purposes. So it's really important that this field is accurately returned. Okay, so now we will have a look at each of those fields in turn, going through them in some more detail. But before we do that, it's really important to remind ourselves of some key concepts when reporting activity. So first of all, we have the academic year, but you might also hear it referred to as the reporting year, and that's the year that runs from the 1st of August to 31st of July the following year. We also have the concept of an instance, which is really important. So an instance is a coherent engagement with the provider by a student aiming towards the award of one or more qualifications or of credit. So that is very important when determining some of these fields and how they should be reported. And then an instance is broken down into years of instance. So the first year of instance will begin when the student starts studying with you towards that qualification. And then the second, third, fourth, and so on will start on the anniversary of that start date in each of those years. So it's really important to keep these terms in our mind when we're going through the details of these key fields. So the first field is LearnStartDate, and this is the date that the student begins their learning on their learning aim, and that's the date that should be captured here. So we don't want any default term dates, and we would expect the start date to be accurate within a week. And we would expect that evidence is maintained to show that the start date has been reported accurately. Now, the best piece of evidence for this is registers. So if you have those, especially if they are kept online, then that's ideal. Any other evidence such as course timetables or date of enrollment may give some assurance, but nothing is going to beat those registers. Okay, the LearnPlanEndDate. So this is the date by which you expect the student to have complete their learning related to the learning aim that they are on. So you should return it when you first start returning that learner, and it shouldn't be updated. So students can study beyond that date, obviously, if they take slightly longer to complete their program. and it should include the scheduled exam period that's part of the structured part of the course, but it shouldn't include resits or exam boards because they're not part of that structured program. LearnActEndDate. So this is the date that the learner completes the learning activities necessary to achieve the learning aim, or the date that the learner withdraws. And it needs to reflect when the student actually stops their learning activities with you on that aim. So it needs to include the exam period because that's part of the structured program, but it shouldn't include resits or exam boards. For students who withdraw or take a break in learning or transfer to a different program, it needs to reflect the date at which their engagement on that aim finishes. So it can't be the date that they request the withdrawal or the date at which you process the withdrawal. It should be their last date of engagement. And one thing to note is that the end date can be backdated into the previous year. So for example, for a student that's on a course that runs until May, June each year, they finish the year, they go off for their summer break, and over that summer break, they decide that they're not going to return to study. Now, the end date that needs to be reported should be backdated into that previous year in the May-June time when they had their last engagement. Now, with everything, evidence should be maintained for end date that's being returned, and with start date, the most preferable piece of evidence is registers if you have them. So let's go through a few examples of these dates. So we have a student who enrolls on a 2-year HND in September 2019. So they attend an enrolment event on the 4th of September, and teaching activity starts on the 10th, which the student attends as expected. Now the LearnStartDate should be the 10th of September because that's when their structured program begins, and that's when they first started engaging with that program. The course is due to finish on the 19th of June 2021, so that's their LearnPlanEndDate. The student undertakes the whole course and sits their final exams as planned on the 19th of June. Therefore, the LearnActEndDate is the 19th of June. Okay, another example. So another student enrolls onto the same course in September 2019. Now the course and teaching activity starts on the 10th of September. But the student does not attend the first 3 weeks of classes, maybe because they are ill, for example, and attends their first class on the 1st of October. So the LearnStartDate for this student should be the 1st of October because that's when they're first engaging with the program. The course is still due to finish on the 19th of June 2021, so that's their LearnPlanEndDate. And the student manages to catch up with the rest of the course and sits their final exam as planned on the 19th of June alongside everybody else, and therefore their LearnActEndDate is 19th of June 2021. Okay, another example here. So a student enrolls on a 3-year degree in October 2020. They attend an enrolment event on the 2nd of October and they attend their first lecture on the 7th. The LearnStartDate, as with all the others, is the 7th of October because that's when the program officially starts and they turned up. The course is due to finish on the 27th of May 2023, so that's their LearnPlanEndDate. Now this student over the Christmas break decides to withdraw, and this is processed by the college on the 15th of January. The student's last date of attendance was actually on the 13th of December before the Christmas break, so their LearnActEndDate is the 13th of December 2020. It is not the 15th of January when the withdrawal was processed. Okay, so our final example here. So we have a student that enrolls on a 3-year degree in October 2018. They attend their first lecture on the 9th of October, making that their LearnStartDate, and the course is due to finish on the 27th of May 2021, and that makes that their LearnPlanEndDate. The student sits their final exams in May 2021, but fails one and is required to resit it in August. They resit the exam and pass it. Now their LearnActEndDate is the 27th of May 2021 because that was their last date on the structured program. Remember that resits should not be taken into account when determining that end date. Now another student on the same course fails all of their exams and is required to return the following year to repeat the whole year. Their end date should also be the 27th of May 2021, and then a new aim should be open to cover their repeat year. So some common issues that are found when we're looking at the dates that are being reported are that generic start dates can quite often be returned for students when they have actually, in fact, started later than the rest of their cohort. So it's important that the dates are student specific and not just put down as a generic course start date. Generic course term and end dates are also used in the LearnActEndDate field, and again the date should be specific to the student and their learning activities. The date of withdrawal processed is normally incorrectly recorded as the LearnActEndDate, so that's quite a common error that we find. So as I've stated before, it should be the student's last date of engagement with the structured part of the course, so whether that be a date of attendance or an exam or something where they've engaged with the course. It shouldn't be the date that the withdrawal is processed. And we also find that there's insufficient evidence of start and end dates. So again, if you keep hold of those registers, that should tick that one off for you. So some good practice here. So make sure that withdrawals and non-engagement is identified and acted upon promptly so you can get those end dates reported as expected. Cases where students do not re-enroll, so for example after the summer break, make sure they're identified and acted upon promptly, so again you can report those end dates as needed. And review the registers regularly to look out for non-attendance, so again those can be followed up as necessary. Okay, so up next we have MODESTUD. So this is the mode of study, and the full definition of mode of study is from the HESIS guidance. Now on the screen here we have a shortened version of the definition for a full-time student, but the full definition is available in Annex H of HESIS 20, which I would recommend that you read. Now, for a student to be classed as full-time, they must meet all three of these conditions. So first of all, they must be required to attend for at least 24 weeks within the year of instance. And then during that period, they're expected to undertake periods of study that amount to, on average, 21 hours per week. And then they must also be charged a full-time fee for the course for the year. Now, if the student does not meet one of these conditions, then they cannot be classed as full-time and would therefore more than likely be part-time. Now, the mode that you are recording in the ILR in the MODESTUD field should be the mode of study at the end of the year of instance, or on the 31st of July if the student's on a year of instance that crosses into the next academic year. Now, mode of study should not be amended if a student withdraws. So if a student withdraws partway through the year, then they might not meet that criteria of studying for 24 weeks. In that case, that doesn't matter. You should be doing it on their study intentions, and they were obviously intending to study for 24 weeks, and therefore they should be returned as full-time. It should not be changed to part-time just because of their withdrawal. Now, records of the mode that the student is enrolled on and any changes to their mode should be maintained and an audit trail kept. So last but not least in this session is STULOAD. Now, STULOAD is capturing the full-time equivalence of the learner during the reporting year, so that's the 1st of August to the 31st of July. Now, a full-time, full-year student would normally have a STULOAD of 100. then part-time, full-time equivalences should normally be determined based on the number of credits studied compared to the related full-time course. So, for example, if you had a 2-year full-time HND and the equivalent part-time course was studied over 4 years, where they were doing half the number of credits each year compared to the full-time course, then the STULOAD for the part-time students would be 50 per year, as that's half the amount as the full-time student. Another key thing to remember on STULOAD is that when a student withdraws or suspends studies or transfers to a different course partway through the year, then the STULOAD should be reduced to reflect that and to return the value that the student has actually undertaken. So, for example, a student is on a normal standard year for studying in September through to May, June time. They're on a full-time course, so for the year their STULOAD would be 100. However, the student decides to withdraw in January. Now, by that point, the student's only done half of the year, and so therefore their STULOAD should be reduced to 50 to reflect what activity they have actually undertaken. And with everything that you return in the ILR, records of how you have determined STULOAD should be kept as part of your audit trail. So let's talk through some examples of STULOAD. So we have a student here that is studying part-time. They intend to study for 3 years with 80 credits in each year. Students on the full-time version of the course with the same qualification aim, they study for 2 years with 120 credits in each year. Now, STULOAD should be returned as 66 for year 1, 67 for year 2s and 3s for those part-time students, so that the total STULOAD adds up to the same amount as it would for those full-time students. So the full-time students would reach 200 in 2 years, so we need to reach 200 in 3 years, and so therefore we end up with the split of 66, 67 and 67. Another student intends to study full-time for 1 year from September to June, but they end up withdrawing in January. Having studied 12 of the expected 30 weeks of the course, then the STULOAD should initially be set at 100 because they were full-time, but we need to reduce it down to 40 to reflect that the student has withdrawn. So some common issues that we find when looking at mode and STULOAD. So one of the big ones is that mode of study is changed for students that withdraw. So remember, as I stated previously, that it should be done on their study intentions when the student withdraws. STULOAD of 100 is returned for students that are starting partway through the academic year or are leaving partway through the academic year. So remember that the STULOAD must reflect the activity that is undertaken within the year, the reporting year, the academic year. So if a student is on a course that runs from January to January, then although that whole year would be a STULOAD of 100, potentially only 50% of that year would have been captured in the first reporting year of the ILR, and so a STULOAD of 50 would be returned with another 50 in the following reporting year, totaling up to that 100. So again, make sure that you're reducing that STULOAD as well for students that withdraw. And make sure that you keep evidence of the STULOAD that you are returning in the ILR. So some good practice. So make sure that the mode of study is clearly documented, including on enrolment forms or equivalent, so it is clear to the student, and also so you have that clear audit trail. And make sure that you keep your records to show how that STULOAD has been determined, especially when you're determining it for students that have withdrawn. So let's have a look at some data quality aspects and how we can improve the quality in these fields. So some validation or internal checks that you could do to ensure yourselves that you've returned the data accurately. So check late learn start dates against registers, just to make sure that those students did actually start later than the rest of their cohort. Do some double checks on the end dates for students that withdraw to make sure that the LearnActEndDate is capturing their last date of engagement, not when the withdrawal was processed. Check that students with LearnActEndDates early in the academic year enrolled and were actually active in that academic year, and not that their end date should have been backdated to the previous year. Double check STULOADs for students who withdraw, so make sure they have been reduced as expected. Add some validation checks in that compare the LearnActEndDate and the STULOAD to make sure they look sensible. And maybe add in some checks on STULOADs for students starting partway through the year. So in that example I gave previously, where the student might start in January. To help you guys out, we are obviously going to be adding some queries and checks into our data checking tool. So these are the areas that we will be looking at in the quality checking output of the DCT. So we'll be looking at unexpected start and end dates and querying those with you. And we'll also be looking at unexpected STULOAD values. So for example, when they're really small or really big, we'll be looking at ones where it looks like the student's withdrawn partway through the year, but the STULOAD hasn't been reduced. And we'll be looking at part-time students as well that look to have a really high STULOAD. All things that we just wouldn't expect to see. Now, they may be legitimate and you can explain those, of course, but they're all there to help you check your data. So that's it for part 1 of the student engagement and outcomes. I hope it's been helpful, and please join me for part 2. Thank you very much for listening.